Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to compare the MPC 1 Plus versus the Digitakt Mark II, and yes, I will be calling it the Digitakt this entire time instead of the Digitakt. I recently did a review slash first impressions of the Digitakt Mark II, and I'll link that below if you're curious about that. But overall, I have had a lot of experience with the original Digitakt Mark I. I got that, I think, in 2018. And I own a lot of Electron gear. I've used pretty much most of the modern Electron pieces. And I'm also very familiar with the MPCs. In fact, the MPC really has taken over as the main creative tool when I'm just writing stuff. And same thing for my wife as well. She uses the MPC Key 61 all the time. With that out of the way, I do want to set up some disclaimers for this video. This is for someone who is aware of these boxes, but doesn't understand the differences between the two, or the difference of how you would go about making music on either one of them. So if you're someone who's already well experienced with the MPC platform and understands how to use the Digitakt, this video is not for you. This is for someone who doesn't understand the differences just yet, but knows that this is $1,000 and this is $700, and why would you pick one or the other, right? So that's what this video is all about. And the name of the game really is workflow. What is the workflow differences between these two? I'm also going to try to make this as short as possible, so I'm going to be skipping a lot of details. And finally, a little shameless plug: if you are planning on picking up either of these boxes and use my affiliate links below, then it directly supports the channel. So if you like this content and you like what I'm doing here, then that's a great way of supporting. So we have two samplers that are very capable of making modern music. What is the main difference between the two? So right off the bat, the MPC is going to be a more expanded, open platform. You're going to be able to do a lot more different projects, a lot more styles of music inside the MPC versus the Digitakt. The reason the Digitakt is more limited in that sense is because you only have 16 tracks total. It used to be 8, now it's 16 total stereo sample tracks. Each one of these tracks is monophonic, meaning you can't play multiple of the same sample in one track. It has to be only one monophonic sample per track, essentially. If you want to use MIDI tracks, you have to dedicate one of these channels to an actual MIDI track. In the original Digitakt, there was 8 mono samples and then 8 MIDI tracks. Now any of these can be MIDI tracks. In comparison to the MPC, you have, I believe, 128 tracks, and each one of those tracks can be either a sample-based track, a sample key group, meaning multiple samples spread across the keyboard. It can be plugins like a Model D, synthesizer, Juno type of experience. It can be CV information, because there is CV gate outs for modular. It can be clip launching style, kind of like Ableton, but a lot more rudimentary. And finally, it can be MIDI channels as well. And on the MIDI side, the MPC really wins out because it has support directly in the back for a USB MIDI hub, which you can then connect to multiple synthesizers directly to and have it communicate on those USB MIDI ports, which makes it very handy because suddenly your MIDI port section right here can be filled with a bunch of different synthesizers, samplers. You can even connect the Digitakt into this. In fact, I'll do that right now. So I just plugged in the USB Digitakt out into the USB in of the MPC, and now, as you can see, Electron Digitakt Mark II is in the menu for MIDI ports. So that makes the MPC platform extremely functional as a hub for all of your MIDI devices for sequencing. I'm going to take this cable back out. In terms of project management, the MPC is always going to be loading stuff into memory, and then that memory is volatile. So if I were to record something in here and then turn off the MPC, it's lost forever. I have to make sure it's saved. So whatever I record in a project, I have to make sure I go over into menu and hit save and save that project, otherwise it's going to be gone. Now that's very different from the Digitakt because the Digitakt has this kind of working memory platform, meaning anything you do to any of these patterns is going to be temporarily stored. And if you want to save the project, you go in and hit save, and you'll save all the data that's actually currently loaded in the temporary space of the memory. Now what's interesting though is the temporary space is persistent beyond power cycles. So I can go into the sampler, hit record something in the sampler right now, hit yes, and say yes to save, and then I can save it, record 000, whatever. And then that is going to be in the memory. So this sample is automatically saved in the memory now. It's persistent. If I power off this machine, that will still be in there under the name that I saved it. In contrast, if I go over to the sampler on the MPC, and then I hit arm, and then I hit record, and then I could record something on here that's coming into the inputs, and I hit stop. Same type of stuff, it's gonna ask me the sample name. Let's just keep it as sample. I'll say keep, and then if I go over to sample edit, here's the new sample that I just recorded that has nothing in the signal. And if I turn off the MPC, this will be lost forever. I have to, once again, save it with the project or save this sample directly into the SD card that's already connected into this MPC, and then I can load it down the road in the future. That's an important workflow difference to keep in mind because you're definitely gonna have to save a lot on the MPC. There is bugs, So if you do run into some sort of bug and you lose a project, if you haven't saved yet, then you lost that project. I personally haven't run into too many bugs that actually crashes the machine and crashes the project, but other people have. This machine definitely has bugs and is not perfect. Same with the Digitakt. The Digitakt has had a list of bugs and has had issues in the past, but Electron has been pretty good about updates and keeping those updates coming down the road. And speaking of updates, of the two boxes, the MPC platform has definitely grown the most. It's had the most features expanded upon it, and it also has options to pay money into it with these features because they sell plugins for this platform. So I had mentioned a Model D plugin. Should go over here. Actually, I have a Jura loaded up right now. If I go program edit right here, you can see this is the Jura interface. This is a paid plugin, so you do not have access to this upon purchasing an MPC. You have to actually create an account on inmusic.com, buy the plugin, attach it to your account, and then log in on your MPC and activate this plugin to be able to use it on your MPC. And you only have 3 activations as well. So if you activate it on your computer and your MPC and then another MPC, then that's maxed out. It's kind of a pain in the ass, honestly, their whole activation system, but it exists. Like, you have the option of buying plugins, the Jura, the Model D, etc. And these are things that if you had bought the original MPC one, you know, however many years ago, it's the same platform that's still getting updates, so you still have access to all these tools that are being updated with the operating system and the features that you can pay for. That's not the case with the Digitakt. It has had features expand, but not to the degree of suddenly having a brand new plugin that generates sound. There has been machines added that adjust the way you can manipulate the samples, but that's pretty rudimentary in comparison to, say, something like the Jura plugin being added into the platform. All the updates on the Digitakt have been free though, and since the Digitakt II just came out, I'm assuming there's probably going to be at least 5 or so years of updates coming down the road. And it's quite possible the Digitakt Mark I could still get some updates as well. Just not really new feature updates specifically, like a new machine that manipulates the samples. Speaking of samples, these are both samplers, and the Digitakt Mark II is a fantastic stereo sampler now. The Mark I is mono, the Mark II is stereo and has 16 tracks, which is one of the big features of the upgraded version. Earlier, I just showed you how to do a sample recording on the Digitakt, and it's very fast and convenient. And also, I showed you how to go into the sampler in here. Of these two experiences, they're both really fast, but I will say the Digitakt is a bit faster, just because you record it, you trim it really fast, and then you can select one of these pads to assign it to, and then you're good to go. You can get a similar experience with this, but the MPC is just a more complicated platform to keep in mind, because if you assign a sample to a drum program, then you need to keep in mind which drum program and which pad you're assigning it to. And the pads go much further than just 16 pads, because you have 16 pads right here and 16 channels right here. But you can also go bank B, C, D, E, all the way up to H. So there's 8 banks of 16 pads that you can choose from per program group. So that means that you just have way more possibilities and way more samples that you can load up per project, with the consideration of how much memory is offered in the machine. And this machine has 2 gigs of RAM, and that might not sound like a lot, but in terms of stereo samples, it's like over an hour of stereo samples. So I personally don't think you're going to be struggling if you're just sampling a few projects here and there. If you're loading entire sample libraries, then it could be an issue, but you should also ask yourself if you're actually going to use those entire sample libraries for every single project. Also, loading all that into the memory of the MPC is going to take some time. So outside of sampling, the other big workflow difference here is how you actually record MIDI, or specifically notes that trigger the samples. So inside the Digitakt, this is definitely more of like a step sequencing workflow, and you can hook up a MIDI keyboard with the MIDI inputs, and you can set up an auto channel and then play directly any of these channels if you want on a MIDI keyboard. But if you're into step sequencing, the Digitakt really excels. Honestly, it crushes the MPC in terms of step sequencing. So I have a kick drum here, snare, various samples. If I look at the recorded data of the kick drum, I hit the record button right here. I have a trigger on step 1 and I have a trigger on step 3. If you listen to this, so you can see it going through and triggering those steps right there. This method is very convenient because you can just hold the trigger. You can go through and adjust anything on the sample to tweak it per trigger. So they're called trig locks, anything that you adjust per step essentially. Very fun, very hands-on way to work with making a beat. So I do like the idea of step sequencing, but when it comes to playing melodic lines and all that, I prefer a keyboard. And this does technically have a keyboard here. It's not velocity sensitive though. These buttons do not have any velocity, so if you want to play say drums, it's all going to be the same velocity. Now, if you record something like that, you can go in and adjust the velocity. And again, if you like step sequencing, then you'll probably enjoy that process going through and individually tweaking velocity for each one. With the MPC, these are obviously velocity sensitive pads, so you can get various levels of sensitivity on there. So that velocity right there in your actual playing is not going to exist on the Digitakt. The other thing that's not going to exist is the resolution that's capable on the MPC. So for the MPC, you could hook up a keyboard and then you could play a piano roll, you know, something like that. And you can record it exactly how it is. In fact, I'll do it real quick. You can go and see. Oh, shoot. I got to take timing correction off. There we go. Now you can see that it recorded basically with my timing right there. This specifically you cannot do on the Digitakt. Now, is that a deal breaker? By all means, no. There is ways around it. You can do ratcheting. In fact, the ratcheting tools on the Digitakt that they added with the Mark II version are pretty extensive actually, and I think a little bit better on the Digitakt platform than the note repeat on the MPC. But in terms of like polyphony, polyphonic instruments, or MIDI that's going to be a bit outside the boundaries of a step sequencer, the MPC is going to be miles ahead of what's offered in the Digitakt. The MPC is going to be closer to what you get in a DAW specifically. And honestly, if you take this a step further and you look at your plugins or any kind of synthesizer that you have hooked up via USB or MIDI, those devices that actually send MIDI CC information can all be tracked with relatively high precision inside of the sequencer, which is really nice. So any kind of information on the Jura, I can technically grab and write with automation data on here relatively easily and simply. You cannot do that on the Digitakt. Even though it does have really cool parameter locking abilities and the ability to write that information while you tweak knobs, the resolution is still set to the steps, so you don't have really nice smooth roll-offs. And if you want to send MIDI data outside of the Digitakt, it does have new MIDI CC features on there, but it's still a few steps involved with connecting those before it becomes useful. Whereas with the MPC platform, it's just automatically good to go. If it's hearing CC information from a synthesizer, it automatically understands that and captures it. I should say there is a step sequencer in the MPC. And yeah, you could use this, but it's pretty well agreed that it's bad. This step sequencer just, you might as well think of it as having no step sequencer at all. Because in comparison, like, there is no comparison. This is a step sequencer. The Digitakt has a proper step sequencer and it's fun and easy to use. Whereas the MPC, it's just, I would not recommend this step sequencer at all. The MPC is definitely going to be something that you want to play more often. So things you have on here are definitely going to be more of the playing experience. And obviously you can time correct all this stuff to however much you want. And you can have strength time correction and various subdivisions and all that. And to be fair, you do have similar things on here with the Quantize. You can quantize to a percentage on these tracks. And also doesn't destructively do it, meaning that you can undo the quantization with this as you need and it will retain the original values of the notes. Whereas the MPC, technically, if you quantize something and give it, say 50% strength, it's then going to readjust the notes, and that's a destructive process, so you will lose your original performance right there. Also, one final thing in terms of bars, or how long a sequence can be, the MPC I believe can go up to like 999. Yeah, you can go up to 999 bars for a particular sequence. So, like I said, it's a little bit closer to a DAW experience. Whereas the Digitakt, it has 8 bars now. It used to have 4 bars, now it has 8 bars. So I would say it lends itself a bit more towards electronic genres and like techno, that type of stuff. Things that don't necessarily need long loops. There is ways of getting around this and expanding it. So you can actually change the speed of individual tracks or the whole pattern. So instead of one-time speed being 8 bars, half-time speed, like say 1/2, would technically mean 16 bars, but then your resolution drops down from 16th notes to 8th notes, and so on, if you follow that path right there. So there is workarounds to longer measures, and I used to use that with the original Digitakt. 4 bars was a bit too limiting. 8 bars is definitely a lot better. But more often than not, I'm usually using 16 bars on the MPC. And the way I do it is I'll typically start with something like, say, 4 bars, maybe do some drums, you know, and then I'll go in here and double the length right here. So if I hit double length, everything gets copied into a second pair. So then if I add another track that is, say, some sort of synthesizer, I could then play an 8-bar version of that. And then if I double it again, I can then have a 16-bar version of something else. So maybe I want my bass line to be 4 bars. I want the chords to be 8 bars, and then maybe some sort of lead that changes and shifts over 16 bars. Very capable and easy to do that on the MPC. Whereas not gonna do that on the Digitakt. So here's the thing. I would say that I can pretty much make anything that the Digitakt makes on the MPC, but the experience is going to take longer and not be as intuitive. The things that I make on the Digitakt are different because I'm usually thinking about how I'm manipulating the samples, and vice versa with the MPC. Because of how much control over the MIDI I have with the MPC, I'm usually making different projects on the MPC. There's also more things to keep track of in the MPC in terms of mental memory and what I'm juggling in a project mentally in my mind. Whereas the Digitakt is a really nice compact experience that's evolved and makes a lot of sense for its space that it takes up on the desk. So I will not be able to cover every single difference here. That video would be way too long. There's obviously filters, there's machine typed, there's obviously filters and various ways to affect the samples in the MPC. The MPC has a software side of it as well that you can load up on the computer. That's a one-to-one copy of what you get on the MPC, but then it's on the computer, and it can also be loaded as a DAW plugin. There's also Overbridge, which Overbridge is not available yet for the Digitakt II as of the recording of this video, but will be available soon. So there's things like that that could get compared. But honestly, if you're considering these two boxes, you know, again, $1,000 versus $700, everything that I talked about in this video is what I would consider for making a choice. If you are into step sequencing, if you really like to get hands-on and program your beats, specifically with steps and triggers and all that, the Digitakt cannot be beat in that department. You can do similar stuff in the MPC, but the experience is going to be a lot more tedious and won't be as convenient as something as the Digitakt. The Electron workflow really has more of like a tracker ethos behind it, whereas the MPC is like a full-on DAW at that point in terms of MIDI resolution and all that. If you need full-on synthesizer plugins and all that, the MPC, like there is no synthesizer plugins inside of the Digitakt. You can load up single cycle waveforms and then treat it like a synth, but it's definitely not going to be the same thing as loading up the Juro plugin or the MIDI plugin inside of the MPC. There's also way more effects in the MPC. You could technically get close to finishing projects inside the MPC, although I recommend still going into a DAW. But nonetheless, it is available inside the MPC. Whereas the Digitakt and the Digitakt Mark II, I'd consider more as an instrument specifically, even though it's doing similar things at the MPC. But it definitely has more of the instrument side of things where you perform with it. And again, you can perform with the MPC as well. So I'm not saying you can't do that, but it's just these subtle differences, these subtle changes of how you use things and the workflow that inspires different projects with it. Okay, I think I've talked enough in this video. That is gonna do it. Hopefully this was useful information. Again, if you're planning on picking up either of these boxes or any other MPC or a new synth for that matter, if you use my affiliate links below, then it helps out the channel directly. So if you enjoyed this content, you found it useful, then that is one of the best ways to support the channel. But yeah, that's gonna do it. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time for another one. Peace.